There are always two sides, or two flanks, to an army. And last week we spent time talking about the left flank, the Union left flank, during the Battle of New Market, which is also the Confederate right flank, just to be clear on that point. In this week's video, we want to talk about what was happening on the west side of the battlefield. The part of the lines that formed the Union right flank, the Confederate left flank, where the troops were positioned either on Bushong Hill or, in the Confederate case, they were making attempts to attack that strong position on Bushong Hill. I'm Sarah K. Byerly with Gazette 66.5, and today we are talking about the fight at the center and the west side of New Market battlefield and the Bushong lines. We're looking from a Federal artillery position overlooking Bushong Field of Lost Shoes. Just wanted to give you a perspective from the Union side over here. Now, it's important to note that some of the things that we're talking about today happened at the same time or in sequence with the cavalry charge and the charge of the 54th Pennsylvania. If you want to learn more about that and the other happenings on the east side of the Bushong lines, go ahead and catch last week's video. Right now, we are going to dive in and take a look at the happenings at the center and the right of those lines. We're going to meet some new units and find out what really happened, what forced the gap in the Confederate lines that set the stage for the cadets from Virginia Military Institute to play an important role in this battle. Now, one of the first things we want to acknowledge is that there is a civilian experience at the center of the fighting lines in this third position during the Battle of New Market, fought May 15th, 1864. The Bushong family farm sits at the heart of the battle. In fact, even when in military terms, when we say the Bushong lines, we're taking that name from the civilian farmland that they were fighting on. Now, the Bushong farm buildings stood just to the south of the Confederate battle line. And if you're wondering what was the civilian family doing during the battle, they did not have time, or they chose not to flee. They chose to stay at their farm. And Jacob and Sarah Bushong, one of their sons, and some of their grandchildren were actually sheltering in the basement as the battle was unfolding. And if you ever have a chance to visit the Bushong farm and can go in the cellar or basement buildings, you'll notice that it's mostly underground, but there's actually some windows in there as well. So they would have been either trying to block those windows for safety, or they may have been peering out and seeing these units rushing by into the lines that were forming just north of their house and barn. So let's start on the Confederate side and talk about some of the units that form the Confederate center on the Bushong lines. The first one that I want to talk about is a group of men from Missouri. Missouri, yes, how do you get Missourians in Virginia? Well, it's an absolutely fascinating story. These guys got captured when they were fighting out in the Western Theater, and as prisoners of war, they got sent east. They were exchanged when there was still prisoner exchange going on between the Union and Confederate sides, and they find themselves in Virginia when they are released due to this exchange. And the war in Missouri was not going well for the Confederates, and they weren't so sure if they wanted to go back to that home state or join another unit fighting in the Western Theater. And these guys realized there was plenty of fighting happening in Virginia. So why go further west if there's a battle happening close to where you were? So Charles Woodson, who was an officer and leader of these guys from Missouri, he petitioned the Confederate government in Richmond to allow him to form this band of men, less than 100, into a military unit. And he got permission, and he ends up taking this band of men and fighting in the Shenandoah Valley. So they're known as Woodson's Missourians, or if you want to be really precise, 1st Missouri Company A, and it's only one company, so small band of men. They start off kind of calling themselves a cavalry unit. At Newmarket, they seem to be fighting dismounted. This Missourian unit will take heavy losses in the Battle of Newmarket. By percent, they will lose the most in the battle. Part of that is due to their exposed position. They are taking a lot of fire from Union von Kiesler's battery, which is set up just across the field from their position. So this unit is helping to hold the center of the Confederate line, but they're also taking massive casualties in the process. We think that there might have been another smaller kind of unattached unit that may have been fighting near the Missourians and at the center of the Confederate lines, and that is going to be the 3rd Confederate Engineers, Company E. Sometimes they're referred to as Hart's Engineers. And these guys actually detach from their unit, which was stationed close to the Tennessee border, and they will come and join Breckinridge's unit. Breckinridge's army. Their unit is not a large group of men, and they shift around positions quite a bit during the battle, which makes them an interesting unit to track through the battle's progression. But we're pretty sure that by the time they're on the Bushong lines, they're close to center, probably near the Missourians, which would also make sense given that these are both smaller units, and if you put 2 smaller units together, you get more men who can help each other out. Now to the west, or the Missourians' left, you have Gabriel Wharton's brigade and his Virginia units. And as we mentioned in a previous video, they kind of ended up staggered as they're moving into the Bushong line, but they will eventually straighten out and be holding a good portion of that line. It's just a little bit of they're being squished by the river's topography as they come into the line initially. Now, anchoring the Confederate left flank, which is different than the Union, is the 51st Virginia Regiment. And if you're taking notes, they are definitely a unit you want to keep track of at this point in Newmarket's history. Because they're on the extreme left of the Confederate line, they have a real opportunity. And the 51st West Virginia tries to execute a flanking movement. They are trying to work their way up the slope of Bushong Hill and threaten the Union artillery batteries that are posted there. For a while, the Union guns hold them off, but these guys are using the topography, and it was something I didn't completely understand until I went out there and started walking their position, and then I started realizing how they were using the topography to get closer and closer to be able to threaten these artillery positions. Also, you learn very quickly when you're there walking on the ground why they could not maneuver and completely flank, and that's because Bushong Hill drops off very steeply, and just to the other side of it, the western side of it, is the Shenandoah River. So the guys basically run out of maneuvering room and are not able to execute a classic flank or side attack. But they definitely maneuver against the guns at this point in the battle, and that would be an important point as the battle progresses. And we'll talk more about what they accomplished in one of our future videos. So now that we've covered some of the Confederate units at the center and then far side of the line, let's jump to the other side of the field, if we will, and talk a little bit about the Union regiment that's going to play a major role. If you want to catch the details of all the lineup of all the units on Confederate and Union sides of the Bushong lines, I'd recommend you watch the video, which focuses specifically on the Bushong lines. But right now, I just want to tell you about one of the Union units that made an important attack, an attempted attack, at this point in the battle, and how that then sets off a chain reaction from the Confederates. So meet the 34th Massachusetts. They charge out into this open field in an attempt to get out there and try to break through the Confederate lines. And I think the idea of the scene is well recorded in a primary source. So I'm going to go ahead and just share a bit of that quote for you. It's actually a part of a report written by their colonel, Colonel Wells. So here's how he describes this regiment's charge. Just then, Colonel Thoburn, the brigade commander, rode along the lines, telling the men to prepare to charge. He rode by me, shouting some order I could not catch, and went on to the regiment on my left, which is the 1st West Virginia Infantry, which immediately charged. I supposed this to be his order to me, and I commanded to fix bayonets and charge. The men fairly sprang forward. As we neared the crest of the Bashong Hill, we met the entire rebel force, advancing and firing. The regiment on my left, again the 1st West Virginia Infantry, which first met the fire, turned and went back, leaving the 34th rushing alone into the enemy's line. I shouted to them to halt, but could not make a single man hear or heed me. I was able to run along the lines and, seizing the color bearer by the shoulder, hold him fast as the only way of stopping the regiment. The wings surged ahead, but losing sight of the colors, halted. The alignment rectified, we faced about and marched back to our position in common time. I could hear the officers saying to the men, and the men to each other, "Don't run! Keep your line! Common time!" On reaching our position, the regiment was halted, faced about, and resumed its fire. The path of the regiment between our line and the fence was sadly strewn with our fallen. So this gives an idea of this attack that the 34th is involved in, going out into this open field. They think they're being supported, they think there are other regiments making this charge, but it turns out they go a lot farther than everybody else and end up getting into trouble. But what's very remarkable about this is they fall back in an orderly manner. The 34th Massachusetts does not leave the field in a panic, and Wells points that out very specifically as he writes about this part of the battle. They made a charge, the charge did not succeed, but they are not forced into a panic or a retreat. They fall back in good order to their original position and continue firing. It's this type of action that is alerting the Confederate commanders that they are still facing Union units that are not giving up and that are fighting back. And that's one of the reasons that it was so crucial that the gap in the Confederate line was filled. So let's talk a little bit about the gap. I keep mentioning this gap that emerges in the Confederate line. Now, first off, there's something you have to understand. There is New Market Gap, and there is the gap in Breckinridge's line. They are not the same thing. New Market Gap is that pass over Massanutten Mountain. We've discussed it before. There was a cavalry fight out in that area. That is not what I'm referring to. That is not where the Virginia Military Institute cadets went. And most of you watching this might be rolling your eyes and thinking, why is she clarifying this? I'm just clarifying it because there might be someone who's watching it that is thinking, well, we talked about New Market Gap, so is that where the cadets went? No. The cadets are going to go and fill a troop separation in John Breckinridge's line along the Bashong fence. So just to be clear, that's what we're talking about with gap. How did the gap in John Breckinridge's line occur? Well, he's stringing troops over this relatively long piece of ground, or long line. And remember, who is at his center? These smaller units, some of them unattached. There's nothing against them. They fought very bravely. They took massive casualties trying to hold on to this position. But as these smaller units get smaller, they are not able to as effectively cover as much of the ground. Makes sense. So then the question comes, well, why didn't the regiments that were fighting a little further west on the line, why didn't they shift down? And the answer is they did. But again, you have fighting going on You have casualties being taken, and these are not huge units to begin with. They are not full-strength regiments, so they are not able to effectively cover and be able to hold against Union attack this entire area of ground. So a gap opens up in the Confederate line. And remember, this is when those Union regiments are either getting ready to charge or their charge has just been repulsed, but they've fallen back in good order. So Breckinridge realizes it will only be a matter of time before the Union officers figure out the weakness in his line and send another assault. It's at this very crucial point that Breckinridge is forced to make a decision. He has to decide how to fill the gap. First off, he thinks we can shuffle troops. We can fill it with the troops already on the field. His staff officers say it's not working. We've already tried that. We're out of options there. We cannot extend their lines to properly cover this area. So now Breckinridge has to decide who to send to fill the gap in his lines. He has two options. He has 2 units in reserve. The first unit he has in reserve are county reserves. So these are older men and very young boys who have been called out as emergency militia or emergency units to help defend these different Shenandoah Valley counties from attack. They do not have military training. Most probably have not had battle experience. And he's not sure that they're going to be the best choice. His second option is the Corps of Cadets from Virginia Military Institute. Why use them over the reserves? They had military training. They had military discipline. They had officers. Even though most of them had not experienced a battle yet, they had the discipline, and Breckinridge knew, or had maybe even seen them under fire on Shirley's Hill earlier that day. So he realized that as a unit, this was a trustworthy group of young men. It was not a decision that Breckinridge took lightly. According to eyewitnesses, he says, "Put in the boys, and may God forgive me for the order." He feels very strongly that this is a difficult decision to make. He doesn't make it lightly, but from military necessity, he will use these young men who had been called out from their barrack rooms, and he will use them to fill this important military position at the center of his line. He didn't know how it would turn out, but ultimately they would play a huge role in helping to secure the Confederate outcome of the Battle of New Market and writing part of the history and historiography of the center and western portions of the battlefield, just by their presence in that area on the lines. As a recap, we've talked about the Missourians, the Engineers, the 51st Virginia Regiment, and then we jumped over to the Union lines and talked about the 34th Massachusetts, the charge that they make into the open field, and what we learn about their retreat from the advanced position, and how the gap in Breckinridge's lines opened up mid-afternoon. It's time to cut this video, and next week's we'll focus on the Corps of Cadets and their role at this point in the Battle of New Market, and we'll also have some more on-location filmed video segments so that you'll actually be able to see more of this battlefield area. I'm Sarah K. Byerly with Gazette 66.5. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed some of the summarized information here and gained a better appreciation for the western side of New Market Battlefield. And maybe it will inspire you to get out there and want to do some battlefielding when the weather cools off a bit. I hope you have a wonderful and inspired week. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.